Welcome to Bald Guy DIY. In this video, I'm going to share the differences between grid-tied and off-grid power generation and some of the considerations you need to know for each one. If you're like me and you live in a heavy industrialized country like Canada or the United States, Europe, different places like that, you probably have electricity provided to your home by an electrical grid, especially if you live in an urban area. As the name implies, a grid is a bunch of interconnected pieces that are supplying one entire structure. And when it comes to power generation, that usually means power plants of all different kinds of fuels, whether that be fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, or nuclear power, maybe something like a wind farm or solar field, all sorts of different sources that get put together in an electrical grid that can be all supplying electricity at the same time. Of course, this is a very complicated system with many different substations, power lines, and all sorts of intersecting parts that need to be calculated, synchronized, and regulated so that they all work properly together. And of course, we all know what happens when there's a failure in that system and how it leads to brownouts or blackouts where the power is either not good quality or when it's not available at all. However, this is a big advantage having an electrical grid than having each city or town provide their own power, which means that it's going to be a much less reliable system with less redundancy, and if something goes wrong, that community could be without power for a long time. Big electricity power plants take months sometimes of downtime if they need to be serviced. So having hundreds or even thousands of power plants linked together means that the overall maintenance for each individual plant can be scheduled and the supply or the customer experience can be very much the same no matter how each one of those power plants is performing on its own. If you live in an urban area, it's probably controlled by bylaws, and in many cases you might not actually be allowed to disconnect your home from the electrical grid, and that's because they want to maintain a base level of service to all citizens and also to have the right kind of protections and controls in place so that there's a safe environment for everyone. This also means that they want to protect the infrastructure there and maintain the cost controls that exist by having all users on the same system. However, if you're in a situation where you live on an acreage or you live in a rural area or a place that doesn't have those kind of regulations, you may have an option to go off-grid or produce all the power that you need on your own. Off-grid basically just means that you aren't part of that bigger electrical system anymore, and so whether you use electricity or not, it's entirely up to you to supply the energy that you're going to use. When it comes to grid-tied, it means that whatever you're doing is still connected to the physical grid, and so you always have that grid attached, which is both a benefit and an expense. So when you think about creating your own electricity, people have different motivating factors for that. The two most common reasons are because of environmental stewardship or environmental impact concerns, and the other is for cost savings, because a lot of times producing your own electricity comes with this expectation that you're getting free energy from the sun, free energy from the wind, and so this idea that you're going to save money is a big part of the motivation for people. Now, I want to explain the differences when you try to produce electricity for a grid-tied system compared to when you provide it for an off-grid system, and also some of the big cost challenges and equipment challenges that come from each of those. So in this video, I'm going to explain the main differences and advantages to having a grid-tied or off-grid system if you have the choice and you want to produce your own electricity. So let's talk a little bit about the grid-tied system first. Now, this is probably the thing that's going to vary the most depending on where you are in the world, or where you are even within the country or which country you're a part of, because each country has such different laws, and even each jurisdiction can have such different laws, that the practicality of producing your own electricity can vary a lot, even from city to city within the same state or province. Where I live in Alberta, Canada, the electricity production laws are quite strict, and as I mentioned before, if you've seen my video on Is Solar Worth It?, there really isn't a worthwhile benefit to it if your only motivation is cost when it comes to producing your own grid-tied electricity in Alberta, because you're only allowed to produce as much electricity as you consume, And if you look at your electric bill, the majority of the bill isn't actually your consumption, but it's all of the delivery, transmission, and administration fees that get added to the bill because you're tied to the electrical grid. So that's one of the biggest disadvantages to a grid-tied system, is that there are regulations in place many times that make the payback or the production of that electricity less cost effective than it could be if you didn't have any controls put on it at all. On my particular electric bill for my home, it's usually between $60 and $100 depending on the time of year and what kind of electrical loads I have connected. And of that, only $15 to $50 is actual consumption charges, and the rest of it is all administration, delivery, and transmission fees. That means that no matter how big a solar system I build or how much I invest, I'm only going to be able to recoup that amount of consumption charge each month. If I was to invest $15,000 or $20,000 into a solar system for my roof and then try to recoup the benefit, it's going to take a very long time to recoup it if I'm only allowed to do a few $100s a year. When you combine the fact that electricity in my area is fairly cheap, it really means that the payback is not practical and the monetary motivation just isn't going to be valuable. Of course, if your main motivation is for environmental impact, then being able to give back and supply some of your own electricity might be a reward in itself, but it's something you have to consider. That's the negative side, of course, to grid-tied systems, but grid-tied systems have a huge advantage in the sense that they are so much more reliable. If you think about all of the hours that exist in a typical year, a grid-tied system, especially in a highly industrialized country, is going to be very stable and reliable. Where we are in North America, the whole system is tied together, and so even if the power generation went out for the entire province, it would be supported from other places within Canada and even the United States. That's an incredible advantage because all of those systems provide this redundant backup if your own generation goes out. Of course, if power lines go down in your area, or if there's a transformer that fails or a car that hits a power pole, you might experience an outage, but you wouldn't expect that to last a very long time, except in very, very extreme circumstances. Most of the power that you're going to generate in an urban environment is solar power, and of course you know that on cloudy days and days in the winter, maybe if you've got snow covering your panels or if they get dirty, you're going to produce less power. And that means that if that's laundry day for you, or if that's a day where you want to do a lot of cooking or baking with your oven, it's really not going to be reliable as a source of power. But having a grid-tied system means that you always have the availability of the grid there, and also you always have use of almost unlimited electricity as long as you're willing to pay the bill. So if I was to boil down the pros and cons of grid-tied, I would say that what you lack in flexibility, you make up for in reliability. When it comes to off-grid systems, you're in a very different circumstance. A lot of times people exploring off-grid live in a rural area or an acreage, maybe even outside the normal power line supply that's in their area. Especially if you're developing a new property out of those urban boundaries, you're probably going to be faced with a decision of if you want to pay maybe even thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to have electricity brought to your property line, or if you want to use an off-grid solution instead. When you're outside the bylaws of an urban environment or outside the restrictive covenants of subdivisions, you really do have a lot of flexibility into what you want to choose. So the lack of flexibility that you have in a grid-tied system is almost completely the opposite in an off-grid system. You could power your home with almost any form of electricity production you'd like. Solar, wind, generators of all different kinds with all different fuels, and many, many different ways of producing electricity. However, with an off-grid system, you also have to put a lot of thought into the overall cost, if cost is your motivating factor, and what the investment in the technology is going to be in the first place. It might cost a few tens of thousands of dollars to have electricity brought a few kilometers from the nearest power line, or it might only cost $3,000 or $4,000 to bring it if it's nearby. But if you space that out over 15 or 20 years, that's not a huge investment. It might cost you quite a bit more to invest in energy producing technology like solar panels, generators, batteries, all of those different things. So your payback might be a lot longer depending on the situation. However, when you think about payback when it comes to off-grid systems, you really get to factor in the entire cost of your electricity bill instead of just those consumption charges. Because all the electricity that you're consuming is something that you created, you don't have to pay any fees to any other providers from then on. So in my own case, where I'm paying $15 to $50 a month for consumption charges and maybe $60 to $100 overall, instead of claiming just those consumption charges, you're benefiting from saving that full amount. Now, when you think that solar panels might cost $15,000, it might still take a long time to pay that back, but it's a different conversation or calculation when you can compare it to the full cost of the bill instead of just consumption. When we compare off-grid to grid-tied though, we're missing that reliability factor. Things like solar or wind or more renewable types of electricity generation, they rely on favorable conditions. So in the middle of a calm night, it's expected you're going to be producing no electricity. So because of this, there's going to be a reliability factor. And to improve the reliability of an off-grid system, you typically have to go one of two ways. The first way would be to add a generator that runs on some kind of fuel that you can use anytime that you don't have optimal conditions for your renewable energy. So anytime the sun is not shining, you have a generator that can supply electricity instead of your solar panels. Or in times when you don't have wind, again, those generators are going to step in and supply the electricity you need. The other option is batteries, which are going to store that energy when you're creating it and then have it available to you when you need it, even if the solar panels are not producing or the wind turbine. Sometimes you're going to need both of those solutions, and in most cases you're going to have both a battery backup system and a generator that are going to support those renewable energy sources when they just aren't producing. It's very possible to produce reliable, constant electricity on an off-grid system, but you need to consider these different factors and mix in different sources of electricity production if you really want to have an around-the-clock 24/7 availability. Of course, you always have the opportunity to change your lifestyle and do things very differently, and maybe you use other sources of gas like kerosene or propane or natural gas, something like that, to light your home, as well as to heat it or even to wash clothes or different forms. There's gas and other types of appliances available that don't always require electricity as well. So just to wrap up the pros and cons of off-grid, the pro is that you save the entire cost that you would normally be paying in an urban environment for a grid-tied system, and you also save the initial investment that might be to bring that electricity to a place where it doesn't already exist. On the con side of things, you have to remember that it may be a less reliable system, especially if you're only going to rely on one source of energy production. And also you may need to invest in a lot more than just the production means, like the solar panels or the generator, and also invest in battery storage so that you can keep that electricity as a backup in times when you're not able to produce it otherwise. Also need to factor in maintenance, fuel costs, and all of those kinds of things that exist and that aren't going to be there if one of those things fail and you still need to use electricity. That seems like more than enough information for one video, but if you'd like me to do a deeper dive into either grid-tied or off-grid electricity production, let me know in the comments or send me an email. My information's in the description below. I love working through the viability of these things, and as technology changes and new things come available, there's always a chance to revisit them and see if they continue to be the way they were or if there's new opportunities available. If you like this kind of content, please give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and check back regularly as I post a new video every weekend, and I post new Ask an Electrician videos pretty regularly, about once or twice a month. If things are drastically different in your area and there's different variables to consider, please let me know that also, and I'd be happy to share that information with others. If you have an off-grid electricity production system, I would love to hear how it works and your feedback on it, how long you've been using it for, and if you would do it differently if you had to start all over again. Until next time, in all your DIY projects, something small or something that powers your whole home, don't be afraid to be bolder.